I'm going to speak to a guy who is a consultant in a particular sustainability network advisory service, public relations, communications, and all of that. Then we're going to have a panel which we will be joined by, from London by the Director of Global Project Management for Turner & Townsend, who are here in Tara Street but have 10,000 employees advising clients who use construction firms for big projects on how they can deal with all this ESG criteria. Chris McCann will be joining us, along with two others, David Fitzgerald of Ornua and Michael O'Shea of Pulse Market. That will be our final panel. So if you're all sitting down, don't forget our charity, Child Vision, and the equine therapy for children. All right. So I'm now going to introduce you to my good friend here, Spiro Comitis, who is the co-lead of the Havas Genus Sustainability Network. And I saw publicity last week. You're welcome, Spiro. Who you've flown in from London today.
I have indeed, yeah.
Thank you, and good to see you here. So tell us, first of all, about Havas Genus. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so we're part of the Havas Group, which is a global media and communications agency. What we realized is that as a group, there were pockets of the businesses within the network. So we have a number of agencies, we have a number of businesses that operate in consulting, all doing little pockets of work in sustainability. And we thought it's so much more powerful if we bring that together into a single network. So we have this umbrella network called Havas Genus, which really works on sustainability issues across the whole spectrum. And I think the thing that makes us quite interesting is we focus on the whole way through. So we work on the transformation of businesses. We have a consulting arm that actually works on how you kind of deliver transformation inside of a business to drive sustainability issues. We do the strategic communications with media, with investors, with shareholders, and we also do the creative communications, which is how you inspire change through the behavior of customers.
So you're a spin doctor, are you?
Well, spin doctor is a way of looking at it. I think the thing that makes us different is we actually kind of drive the change from the inside. But spin doctor is a good thing to kind of be talking about and thinking about, because one of the thing about a lot of service, so any service type professional service agencies, you can attribute about 28% of the world's carbon emissions are directly related to the work that advertisers, professional services like consultants, lawyers, et cetera, actually create, so if you look at our own footprint is actually really, really minuscule. The impact that we can have is absolutely huge.
Okay, so let's talk about today's agenda of ESG and best-in-class communications. So I am at heart, because I've been around for 40 years, at heart very cynical of some of this stuff. And I want to talk through with you what is authenticity insofar as some of the people with the greenest corporate credentials, when I speak to my NGO friends who have dedicated their adult lives on a completely without remuneration basis, Friends of the Earth, environmentalists, members of the Climate Advisory Council, they, really, don't speak the same language as the people who are, and they accuse people of greenwashing. So, what's the difference between authentic ESG and greenwashing, and how can you smell it and touch it and feel the difference?
Yeah, so greenwashing, I think, is probably the biggest problem that we actually have in ESG today. And the reason I say, if you take the NGOs on the one hand, they're almost in the reverse of greenwashing. They're out there doing amazing work. They're generally focused on purpose-led issues, and nobody gets to hear about it. Nobody actually knows about it, and it's often very hidden in the background. At the other end, we've got companies that we're hearing about day to day, like they're doing amazing things, but actually when you dig under the surface of it, you don't actually see anything, or you don't actually hear anything. So greenwashing is a couple of things. I think there are probably two ways that we kind of see greenwashing actually manifest. The first is what I call misdirection. It's a bit like any illusionist, is they kind of have you looking over here and not looking at the kind of things that you should be looking at. And you see a lot of the oil companies doing this at the moment. So we've spun up this wind farm, we've spun up offshore wind, we're setting up these entire solar fields, charging networks, and that's all true. It's absolutely all true. But the materiality of it, when you look at what the whole company is actually doing, is actually small and not very significant. And so I think there are kind of two types. One is kind of just making us look at the things we should be looking at and not look at the things that we ought to be looking at. And then the second is where it's a bit of misinformation. And misinformation is where the reality of what they're doing and what they're talking about they're doing are actually two very different things. And that is the kind of thing that sort of comes about. Targets come into this a lot. You see a lot of companies talking about targets out in 2050. It's really easy to set a target into 2050. It's much harder to link that back to today's actions and what we're actually doing today.
So if that's greenwashing, what is green blushing?
Green blushing. So green blushing is a term where there are probably two parts to it. One is thinking about, there's so many companies that are scared to talk about what they're doing for fear of some of the backlash that might be dubbed as greenwashing. And that's either because what they're doing is starting to move in the right direction, but they don't necessarily have a history of doing the right sort of things, and so are kind of scared to talk about it. And in some ways, that's a real shame, because actually some of these companies are actually doing some really interesting things, moving the needle, and I think it would be better if they're talking about what they're doing in the context of what they used to do, that actually shows real progress, rather than actually fearing the backlash.
It sounds like a sort of oxymoron in terms of a dichotomy. People who are out should be spinning their message, should be proactive in their communications, hiding their light behind a bush. That sounds a bit implausible.
Yeah.
Green blushing.
Yeah, and
they're doing good things, but they don't want to tell the world.
Well,
about
it's often so it'll be organizations like the one that kind of springs to mind is Nestle, for example. Is they've had a lot of bad press about some of the things that they've actually done. They're starting to make inroads in the right direction. Don't really want to talk too much about it because of actually some of the kind of, you can relate it to other issues that are going on in the organization. And I completely get that. And so there is,
they just don't want to be the center of attention.
Yeah, or for
they
fear
keep the
of,
head down.
Yeah, you can get a lot of bad publicity for doing good things if it kind of relates to other areas of your business where you still need to make progress. And I think that's where the authenticity piece that you talked about really comes in, because it's quite. If all we do is we set targets out in 2050 and we have some actions here, but we can't relate what we're doing to where we're trying to go, it's very easy to be tarred with a greenwashing brush, even if it is the right thing.
So what's time washing? Time
washing is a new term, I think. I didn't really even know much about this, but as a term. But time washing is the way we talk about targets. It's so easy to set a target that's so far into the future. I mean, I do it every Christmas. Every Christmas, I talk about how much weight I'm going to lose in the next year.
Yeah.
Exactly, and then end up making the same thing in the next, in the next season. When you look at the scale of the challenge of what we're actually trying to do, so the science-based targets that everybody's setting around 2050 are so ambitious, but it's so easy to do. We're going to, hit net zero by 2045 or 2050. If you really look at what that actually entails, that means reducing emissions by half by 2030 and continuing to reduce them by half every decade until 2050. That's an equivalent of reducing them by 7% every single year. If you look at what in the height of COVID, where nobody was flying, nobody was driving, there was no logistics moving around the world, emissions reduced by only 5.5%. So that was less than what we actually need to be doing. So unless there is the ability to bring that target closer and closer and closer to something that's very real and very tangible, that is kind of greenwashing in a time horizon.
So, I spent 20 years in Parliament, and I was a member of government and all this kind of thing. And politicians realise that if they don't get elected at the next election, they go into liquidation. And therefore their horizon is really only for the next election. So if I'm a minister right now and I set targets for 2030, I mightn't be the minister in 2030 and when the chickens come home to roost.
Yeah.
So we are brilliant at targets. In fact, we've increased our targets, we've legalized our targets in this country with the Climate Act. But when I go, because I have to live in the real world now, not in the political bubble, I go to agriculture and I listen to the smartest people who talk about genetics, feed additives, slurry application instead of chemical fertilizers, ammonia, the ban. It'll get you a 14% reduction. They've agreed to a 25% reduction. The whole problem is the growth of the national dairy herd, more output, 16 billion worth of dairy produce. We do it off of grass. We do it better than anyone else in the world. Cars. Our target is 850,000 by 2030, EVs. Plug-in EVs. The best case scenario, if we double and treble the rate, will be about 150. It's a joke. It won't happen. And the biggest problem is the people buying EVs are in South Dublin who should be using public transport, right? And they cost 50 grand each, and therefore the old bangers that are 16-year-old, they won't ever be able to afford an EV. The whole thing is just a joke, right? And I could go on about retrofit of the built environment, and I just know that all of these targets, so put it like this, what extent of all of this, is it like CSR? I sat on boards of companies in up to 2008, and when 2010 came along in the crash, there was an item on every board agenda called corporate social responsibility. And when the manure hit the fan, that just wasn't mentioned anymore because they were talking about survival. So as a hard-bitten cynic who's been through bankruptcy, explain to me what's real about this and what is PR.
Yeah, so I think when you look at the communication that kind of comes out at the back end, the PR end of it, that's the end point of something. And if what we're starting with is the communication, that's kind of where we're starting to fail. You need to kind of go right back to where does this really come from? Like we worry about, and this is really where I think targets are a problem. And anyone who talks to me knows I have a little bit of a downer when it comes to these targets because they're so far out into the future and they're so hard to actually make real. I think the other thing about the targets that we're actually talking about is when you even, you've talked about the scale of what we're trying to achieve, and you look at what the targets themselves are actually trying to do. Our science-based targets are talking about if we cut emissions to zero over the next 30 years, we get a world that's 1.5 degrees. We're currently at 1 degree. So in a way, what we're saying is the targets that we're actually setting are, if we do the absolute best we can do, we're going to end up worse than we are today. That's the equivalent of sitting in a business and saying, next year's plan is that if we do everything brilliantly, we'll lose a bit less money next year than we lost this year. And that just doesn't wash. And it makes it really, really hard to do. It comes back to your opening statement in this was, this is a complex problem. And a complex problem is solved by collaboration and how we all work together. We were having a chat with Tom Rivet-Carnac. I don't know if many of you have read his book. He was one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. And they knew that actually the targets they were setting in Paris were unattainable, but what they had to do is get everybody to the table. And so what was more important to them is actually getting everyone to the table. And I think it's the same case here, is what we've got to do is figure out, in a complex system, we need to figure out how to do more of this and less of that, and not worry about the exact numbers that are actually getting us there. And the action is starting to nudge us in the right direction. What that means is something really, really important. Rather than what are we saying at the back end of this, we've got to start with the right mindsets at the beginning. So when we talk about CSR being an agenda item in the boardroom, that's completely the wrong way of going about it. We have to get to a point where if we've got the right mindsets, we can then set the right ambition. And the right ambition is about how we're actually changing the world and what companies are doing it. And if they're going to do that, they have to thread this right through the middle of their strategy. It can't be an agenda item at the bottom of A or B in terms of what we're actually doing. It has to be fundamentally driven through the center of the strategy, and then we start to get into the right place. So there's some interesting companies like Reckitt who are doing exactly this. They don't have a sustainability strategy. They have a business strategy that achieves all of their sustainability goals. So there is never a discussion in the boardroom about, do we cut this or do we not do this? They kind of run it straight through the middle of what they're doing. And everything that they do is about, they're not even apologetic for growth, because they're saying all of our growth is going to come from sustainable products.
Okay. You're from London. I have to ask you about the topical situation, because we heard this morning that the biggest driver of the ESG agenda is in fact not government necessarily, because that's a slow process and enforcement takes time. It's actually the trillions of funds that are in pension funds, hedge funds, and so on. So I was watching Newsnight last night, and they very easily, and I read the Financial Times last Saturday, they explained it to me in terms that even I could understand.
And maybe I might.
Well,
yeah.
I just want to follow this through with me. So the way it is this, that they have liabilities, which is paying out all the pensions, and they have assets, and they put them into a bond or a fund or whatever. And what's happened is that the cost of return, people are selling these bonds rather than buying these bonds, and the interest rate had to make them more attractive, up to 5%. But even that didn't work, right? And then the Bank of England intervened and said, well, we'll buy the bonds and we'll make them even more. So the governor of the Bank of England says, on Friday, we're going to stop buying these bonds, right? It's burning money, right? So now we have the prospect of the market may decide, UK is a basket case, we're going to go to 10%, but the asset value goes down and pension funds may go bust. Where does that leave ESG? And all this investment strategy, if you're going bust in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, you're in topics which I'm completely uncomfortable talking about and not knowing.
This is where the real world...
But I think this is where it comes down to where are the drivers for a lot of these things. We've heard a lot this morning about, 51% of capital available through ESG networks. I think there is a shift in what's going on in the world. That change comes from the decisions you and I make about where we put our money and where we put our pensions. So probably, interestingly, we talk about where are the changes that people can actually make. Probably one of the biggest changes we can make as individuals is actually just deciding where we put our pension fund and supporting funds that actually support the ESG agenda. That is probably the most fundamental thing that any one of us in this room can actually do. We did a survey as part. We do a survey every year called the Meaningful Brand Survey. Obviously, we're kind of quite consumer business focused, and this is looking about what actually makes brands meaningful, as opposed to what the survey really showed is 71% of brands could just disappear; nobody would actually care. And this year we've brought in a whole lot of dimensions around sustainability and the whole sustainability agenda. What was super interesting about that is when you look at Gen Z, they are 36 times more likely to cancel a brand for its sustainability credentials than the baby boomers are. And it's really interesting because that's the next wave of people who are investing in pension funds, who are kind of driving what's going on, who are the employees of the future. So I think, it's an intricate ecosystem that we actually operate in. I'm not really qualified to talk about the finance system and how it all works, but I think the choices that we make as individuals and the choices that we make as employees and the choices that we make as boards and directors and the choices we make as businesses are really what kind of makes it work here.
So if the reduction in Ireland of 51% of carbon by 2030 is not going to be attained, right? Is net zero credible?
So the thing we've got to look at is, and I take a lot of heart from having chatted to Tom Rivett-Carnac about this, because when they as they set up the Paris Agreement, what they realized is they missed their first targets by miles. They were so far off agenda that there was no chance that what they were doing was actually going to hit the targets. What was more important to them is the realization that this global problem is only going to be solved by having all countries in the world there and all countries in the world at the table. Most importantly, the countries that are actually feeling the pinch are the countries that didn't actually cause the problem. Having them there as part of the solution was really, really important. The next iteration of that has brought, global targets much closer because you've got everybody involved. And I think it's the same thing here, is net zero is only possible if we've got everybody starting to think about it and starting to work together. So the penetration of electric vehicles is a really, really interesting one, particularly in Ireland. So if you think about it, one of the big problems of electric vehicles is range anxiety. Don't really have that here. Small island, the ability to kind of get everywhere is actually brilliant. You look at where Sweden has gone, they've got to the point where, they're past that tipping point. You've got to get it to tipping points, which is why the actions of more of this and less of that is more important than the 51% that we actually hit. More people buying EVs, more affordable EVs, more incentives to do EVs is much more important than exactly where we are today.
Okay, finally then, for people in the audience here, different businesses, we have property, we have public sector, private sector, we have people in manufacturing, people in professional services and so on. What would be your generic ESG communications advice to them?
Yeah, so the most important thing I think is the communication is the end point of everything that you've done. That same survey that I talked about actually showed most consumers don't care. They don't want to know what companies are doing. They don't want to know what companies' plans are. They want to know what they're actually doing and how those measure up. That means ambition. We've got to start with the right mindsets and ambition. And ambition is really, really important. I'm really inspired listening to Ashling Curtis talk about what Microsoft is doing, because that's ambition beyond targets. That's not we're trying to get to a point where the world, we're just everything will be a little bit worse. Going back to 1975, what I didn't realize about Microsoft was 1975 is when they were founded. That's about going out there and saying, we're not just going to, hit net zero. We're going to remove all the carbon that we've ever put into the atmosphere. So I think the first thing is, you don't have to go that far, right? The first thing is, if you get the ambition right, and that allows you to kind of bring it onto the board agenda as a core part of the strategy, that drives all plans and actions. And then what you're talking about can be authentic, even if it's only small increments. The ability to say, we've done this, we started here, but we're trying to get there and we're on plan or we're off plan. It's actually okay to say we're off plan. There's a warm reception to saying we're slightly off plan, but this is what we need to be doing about it.
So it's almost about intent.
Intent matters and honesty matters. Even the best companies in the world at this, there are a lot of poster children like Patagonia is the company that everybody looks to. They will say, we recognize that we are still part of the problem. I think that matters a lot. Is the authenticity of communication is about being really clear about exactly where you are and exactly what you're doing, even if you're not on track with where you want to be.
Okay, Spiro, thank you for coming over from London to talk to us. I've learned a lot. Spiro Comitis, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.